I need to start by apologizing to you on behalf of a friend of the show. You'll recall that Winston Churchill started to make his thousands of pounds after writing best-selling books like The Story of the Malakand Field Force, The River War, and later on, From London to Ladysmith via Pretoria. These were just the first of dozens of books this very gifted writer and famous British statesman wrote. Unfortunately, my friends over at Masterclass did not get him on their platform in time for him to teach a class on writing. So for now, you'll have to settle for Malcolm Gladwell teaching you how to write nonfiction, for David Baldacci teaching you how to write a mystery novel, David Sedaris teaching you how to write using humor, or R.L. Steyn teaching you how to write for young audiences. I'm sorry that they can't do any better for you at this point. I'll see if they can at least get Rudyard Kipling on to teach how to write poetry before it's too late. For now, you'll just have to settle for all the New York Times bestsellers trying to teach you how to write, or world chess champion Garry Kasparov teaching you how to play chess on Masterclass. Just use the link in the show notes to settle and support the show. Now to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
So far, the South African War didn't appear to be going well for either side, but for different reasons. Joubert bogged war forces down in Ladysmith by not storming the city when the time was ripe, and then committing a large force that dwindled to besieging Ladysmith. Though Joubert did venture with Botha south of the Tugela towards Durban for a time, Joubert eventually ordered a retreat back across the Tugela. So now, thousands of Boers remained invested in Natal, but far enough away from the port city of Durban to allow British troops to easily dock and reinforce the colony. Though Mafeking scarcely had 1,000 soldiers and volunteers defending it, General Piet Cronje opted to besiege Mafeking with his 8,000-man force. Rather than storm the Mafeking's Paper Tiger force, or, better yet, rather than divert most of his force to encouraging more Boers to rise up deep inside the Cape Colony, Cronje chose to besiege Mafeking in comfort, much like he had besieged Potchefstroom in comfort during the First Boer War. General Christian Wessels, Commandant-in-Chief of Orange Free State Forces, committed thousands of troops to besieging Kimberley, not only for the diamond industry, money, coal, foodstuffs, engineering workshops, scrap iron, dynamite, and black labor there, but also because Kimberley housed South Africa's most obnoxious imperialist, Cecil Rhodes. Taking down Kimberley with Rhodes would have the advertised effect of boosting Boer morale to new heights. But Colonel Robert Keekwich took the initiative and fortified Kimberley and the large perimeter around it before the Boers began their siege. Kimberley stood as the strongest and most populous town the Boer besiegers surrounded. But again, this Boer siege met little success over a month into the South African War. The arrival of Orange Free State President Martinus Steyn may have boosted morale and Steyn's image, but did not change the course of Kimberley's siege. Not even Cus de la Rey and his commandos arriving on Kimberley's scene changed anything. Very limited numbers of Boers did eventually drive into the Cape Colony and pick off low-hanging fruit. Some of Steyn's Free State commandos cooperated with insurrectionary Cape Boers to take small towns of Alival North, Dordrecht, Albert, and Barkly East. Free State General Isaias Grobler and Transvaal General Hendrik Schoeman focused on low-hanging fruit in the Colesberg area, but did not take control of the Nauwpoort railway junction. Duploy and Swanepoel led commandos in plundering black inhabitants in Burgersdorp in the Western Cape Colony. Some Boers saw the potential of seizing key railway points in the Central Cape Midlands, accumulating rebel Cape Boers, and forming a line running from Gordonia's northern region of the Cape Colony towards the western edge of the Cape Colony to keep the British from flanking the Boers. Then driving down to take Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and East London. This was never to be. Wherever Boers did establish some semblance of control in the Cape Colony, they annexed those regions as Republican territory. They rewarded Cape rebels with government posts and property stripped from Cape residents loyal to the British. Blacks, forced to follow even more oppressive pass laws. Blacks, stripped of property and often forced to work on rebel Cape Boer farm. Boer treatment of Cape blacks and whites loyal to the British kicked off a vicious cycle of Boer administrators being increasingly more brutal and totalitarian towards Cape blacks and whites, because Boers suspected these embittered residents would rise up without harsh repressive policies. Though the Boers didn't swarm all the Cape Colony, they did endanger many sectors of the Cape Colony's communication system. But Free State commandos inexplicably neglected to blow up the Orange River Bridge, guarded by a handful of British troops. This red, single-track lifeline linked the western Cape Colony to Kimberley, Mafeking, and Rhodesia. Yet, the Boers did not blow this bridge or seize control of it. Young commanders like Kus de la Rey and Christian de Wet and Louis Botha resented the amateurship of older generals that did not show unity of command, did not show willingness to coordinate efforts, and did not fully take advantage of Republican sympathizers in the Cape Colony. Cape Republicans that could have radically altered the course of the war if sufficiently mobilized. Now, why did the Boer generals flounder so much at the beginning of the war when offensive initiative was needed most? We will get to that shortly, but first, let's look at how General Buller responded to the news of the aforementioned sieges and to the problems he inherited when he arrived in South Africa.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Remember that journalist Winston Churchill and General Redvers Buller receiving news en route to South Africa, first of the Boer invasions of the Cape Colony and Natal, then of 3 British victories and General Penn Simmons's death? Upon landing at the Cape Colony, General Buller and the throng of 300 aboard the Dunnottar Castle heard news about Elandslaagte, Glencoe, and Rietfontein. On land, General Buller received briefings about mournful Monday's disasters. He had some difficult decisions to make. Cecil Rhodes, in Pakenham's words, was braying like an ass at Kimberley, threatening to surrender Kimberley if the British didn't send relief as soon as possible. This Rhodes threat wasn't altogether empty, since he was supplying 75% of Kimberley's force from his own pockets. As we mentioned before, the Boers who did drive into the Cape Colony wreaked enough havoc and presented enough of a threat to British communication and transport systems to raise concerns for Alfred Milner and General Buller. In the summer before the South African War, British Cabinet member Michael Hicks Beach insisted on a tight budget for war preparations, despite Sir Garnet Wolseley's call for 50,000 British reinforcements to South Africa. This made any offensive and defensive plans of Buller to feel a lot more like empty hopes. Buller initially hoped to drive west from the Cape Colony through ground he knew well towards Bloemfontein, then Johannesburg and Pretoria. If British forces in Natal didn't get out of position, Buller's advance would knife into the Free State and thus take pressure off British forces in Natal. But as we already know, General White played his hand badly around Ladysmith, leaving British forces there in a lurch, in a situation too desperate to wait for Buller to concentrate all forces on a steamroll through the Free State. To Alfred Milner's great disappointment, General Buller opted to spread his forces to address three priorities. Generals Gadiker and French would lead some of his force through the Cape Colony's Midlands to put down war-incited insurrections. Lieutenant General Lord Methuen would lead 20,000 soldiers towards Kimberley to eventually clear the way for an invasion of the Orange Free State. General Buller would personally lead more than 20,000 troops, more than half of his army corps, to saving Natal. Alfred Milner was sad to see Buller go, because Buller had spiked morale in the Cape Colony while there. You already heard back in episode 1.22 that the Boer chances of winning the South African War were slim to none from the start. Then, Boer military leadership tilted their chances solidly towards none with their early mistakes. But why did wars have such atrocious generals at the top to begin with? You cannot answer this question by merely pointing out poor decisions that Joubert, that Prinsloo, and company made early on. The answer is largely structural and largely cultural. Historian Ian van der Wag wrote the following quote: "The pre-war Boer leadership, without civil-military differentiation and in the pocket of a small coterie, was reactionary, suffered from an accumulated intellectual deficit, and was unequal to the Herculean task before it in 1899. Lionized by a public eager for tradition and heroes, the senior commanders, well-versed in small African wars, were arrogant and obsessed with their own importance, occupying as they did the pinnacle of the Boer societal pyramid." End quote. Remember in episode 1.13, I told you about the fact that to be a high-ranking general meant you owned a lot of property, in the Transvaal at least. As the war went on, men not only of property, but of military ability climbed to the top of the ranks. From the 18th century on, wealthy frontier farmers in South Africa served as the higher commandants, or at least field cornets. If these frontier farmers didn't fill these leadership positions, they wielded their influence to put a client of their fiefdom into those leadership roles. Their authority corresponded to their access to weapons and ammo. These men often operated like lords of independent fiefs and would ignore, oppose, or flee the authority of Cape Town when they could. Field cornets, the many lower-ranking officers in Boer societies, took responsibility for tax assessment and collection after 1868. Field cornets were elected, as were the higher-ranking commandants. Brave, but tactically efficient men emerged in more field cornet positions, while commandant positions usually stayed in the hands of the richest, most influential Boer families. So these Boer officers worked closer to full-time as government administrators, who often used their power to acquire more wealth. The Commandant General position was a stepping stone to higher office. The Commandant General held a powerful central position, especially in the Transvaal. There, the Commandant General fixed the prices of commodities and managed the distribution of arms and ammo from Cape, Natal, and Portuguese traders. After defeating the British in the First Boer War, the Transvaal's Volksraad decided that the Commandant General should be elected to 10-year terms and sit on the Executive Council. Commandants would be elected to 5-year terms, field cornets to 3-year terms. Ordinary burghers voted for these leaders. As President Paul Kruger and General Piet Joubert clashed, a new law in 1894 shortened the Commandant General position's term to 5 years. Your power in the Boer republics also stemmed to an extent from your ability to get people to see close genealogical ties to the early Voortrekkers, to early Boer families who resisted British rule. For example, General Daniel Erasmus and General Christian de Wet were President Krier's cousins. General Cus de la Rey and Louis Botha were related to President Krier. All of these, with the exception of de Wet, were thought to be related to Karl Trihart. Quote, well exercised in African campaigning and regularly oiled with Matshuba stories, Boer overconfidence resulted from misuse of history myth-making, particularly regarding Matshuba, rigidity, and the inability to innovate. This was enhanced by institutional biases against feedback, particularly if from younger men or foreigners, that contradicted traditional conceptions and preparations for war drawn up by the elitist and, by and large, incompetent Tsar generals, who to a man were uneducated and with an average age of 58, elderly. They had little training and no military education, although, on average, they had vast, small campaign experience. End quote. Your family status, your age, your likability, your long white beard stood for much more than innovative genius, even as the South African War began. Transvaal military command was dominated by men drinking the Krier Kool-Aid, men on President Paul Krier's good side, not men of military merit. Early in the South African War, this showed. For example, the General Schoeman, who led wars to raise hell in the Cape Colony, was eventually arrested, then demoted to an ordinary Boer, and then arraigned for treason. General Lucas Meyer earned distinction for paralysis in the heat of battle and poor decisions when he did take initiative. General Meyer and General Daniel Erasmus opting for safety during the Battle of Talana Hill cost the Boers that battle. Erasmus reportedly deserved dismissal for disobedience and his lack of leadership ability. Because Jan Kok disobeyed his orders, he led men under his command to deadly defeat at Elandslaagte. Krier himself interfered in South African War operations by keeping his incompetent buddies secure in their command positions. Krier would instead proclaim his belief in the help of God when his favorites were criticized. And we have already talked about how even Joubert himself knew that he wasn't a good general. Though General Piet Cronje was popular among his commandos, he was too arrogant and foolish to take Cus de la Rey's advice to circumvent Mafeking and cut deeper into the Cape Colony. Cronje preferred siege warfare from a recent but now bygone era. This electing of officers allowed popularity contest winners like Piet Cronje and other wrong sorts of leaders to rise in the ranks. This electing of officers also fed a lack of military discipline already built into the Boer military. Even if you were a competent tactician, you would still fail as a leader without tremendous force of personality. Officers could never count on all their men to be ready for action when called on. These officers typically had little education and no military education, except for military education born from the personal campaign experiences or famous myths like Matshuba. About 2,000 foreigners served with Boer forces during the South African War, but little of their military hardware or military expertise or even modern medicinal approaches were well received or utilized. Boers remained skeptical of foreign ideas, and that isn't to say that Boer leaders stood in tight unity themselves. They rarely coordinated their operations, even before the guerrilla phase of the war. Incompetent military leadership persisted until 4 subordinates of merit instilled much-needed military discipline and installed much better tactics. Historian Ian van der Wag refers to these new leaders as the 4 geniuses of the war. 21 years younger on average than the old guard, these geniuses were State Attorney Jan Smuts, Cus de la Rey, Christian de Wet, and Louis Botha. One of these geniuses of the war will appear in two of the earliest British offences in the Cape Colony. To these offences, we now turn. If you know someone who is interested in military leadership structures throughout time, or know someone who is interested in how leadership structures emerge around the world, share this episode with them, or even share the episode in a Facebook, LinkedIn, or other social media group that would value the information. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts and have yet to go to the show and scroll down to where you can give Forgotten Wars a 5-star rating and write a brief review of what you found most interesting from the show, take these next few moments of awkward silence to do so. Don't worry, I'm still here and we'll give you more time. Now back to the show. On November 23rd, Paul Sandford brimmed with excitement. In the 1880s, Sandford served as a major under Sir Garnet Wolseley in Egypt. Then Sandford served as commander of the Mounted Infantry Corps during Sir Charles Warren's Bechuanaland expedition. You learned about that in episode 1.15. Sandford inherited his father's title in 1891, Baron Methuen. On this November day of 1899, Lieutenant General Methuen held his first independent command. He led his force of around 8,000 to 10,000 men from the Orange River Station towards the Orange Free State. Methuen passed word on to Colonel Keekwich that his large force would relieve Kimberley within a week unless anything went wrong at Modder River. But Methuen had horrible scouting reports and few mounted troops to rely on. He lacked mounted troops because he had to start this campaign a month earlier than expected. Scouting the extremely flat area made you a viable target for a Mauser-wielding Boer from over a mile away. Free State Boers knew the land all too well. The Boers spread out their troops in small detachments to keep good lines of sight and fire on the advancing British forces. Commandant Jacobus Prinsloo, not to be confused with any of the other handful of Prinsloo's in this war, led 2,000 men at a hill near Belmont, with orders to hold off Methuen until Piet Cronje slipped some more Boers over. Methuen learned from some earlier British mistakes. Just days earlier, Boers shot up a small British reconnaissance team, killing or wounding 4 officers. One of the officers shot through the head. The leader of this failed reconnaissance mission, Colonel Goff, lost his command. He blew his brains out after this humiliation. One soldier declared that the Boers did not play fairly. Methuen took away a different lesson. His officers hid, stripped, or discarded the shine from their rifles, swords, and uniforms. There would be no telegraphing to Boer marksmen which Brits were officers. Nasson writes, quote, "One soldier recalled a heart-stopping moment, clawing forward through a strangely full stillness and expecting the Boers to open up with every passing second. This came in the form of concentrated crossfire, its costs bore mainly by the Grenadier Guards. Nevertheless, overall losses were reduced by Methuen, who had sensibly thinned out rather than massed his advancing troops. Moving across the veldt in open formation deflected some of the force of the blanketing, repelling rifle fire." End quote. The Boers' brutal barrage of bullets could not ultimately stop the British from reaching the hills they defended. So the Boers melted away northwards, thanks in part to Methuen's lack of mounted troops. The Boers left behind 3 times as many dead Brits. Methuen wrote his wife that night, quote, "People congratulate me. The men seem to look on me as their father, but I detest the war the more I see of it." End quote. Outside his tent, Methuen could hear, quote, "A poor fellow groaning and dying, shot through the chest. He is at last silent, so perhaps God has released him." End quote. To add to the bitter stew, there were claims that the Boers had abused the white flag again in battle. Some surrendering Boers were shot in retaliation. Many Boers lost enough faith in Commandant Jacobus Prinsloo's tactics or proved unwilling to fight in a controlled retreat. When Koos de la Rey showed up with Cronje's reinforcements and provisions, the Commandant Prinsloo's force merely reverted back to its original Belmont strength of roughly 2,000 commandos. 2 days later, on November 25th, Methuen struck again at Graspan. De la Rey placed his Boer forces along the summit of an arc of small hills, or koppies. They built earthworks with secured evacuation routes. But Methuen found De la Rey's position easily. Nasson writes, quote, "Preceded by heavy artillery bombardment of frontal entrenchments, which drove the enemy firing line back from the summit, British infantry stormed in. After a bitterly fought engagement, the Boers yielded again to superior odds and fled on horseback, harried by British shelling. The fugitives dragged away most of their dead and wounded, along with rifles scooped up from abandoned corpses. Yet again, it had been a bloody effort with the British casualty rate of 300. That was more than double that of the Boers. If beaten there, the Republicans were nevertheless still able to save something. For by tactically abandoning their posts to regroup, they continued to elude the British to fight another day." End quote. Though these tactical victories bloodied many a Brit, Methuen remained confident that his force would reach Kimberley on time. Time would prove Methuen wrong.